Apple now has billions of dollars, but in the 90s, that wasn't the case. By all accounts, they were months away from going bankrupt. So taking that a step further, imagine a world where the iPhone doesn't exist and Apple goes bankrupt.
Guys, MKBHD here, and welcome to the full review of the Polaroid T-Phone.
Windows Phone 10.
It's the Nokia 3310 Gen 11.
Apple's greatest successes have not been in the Fortune 500.
The last few years have reminded me that life is fragile.
I can tell you why the sky is blue. I can tell you why the sun.
When people think of Xerox today, if they do at all, they maybe think of them as part of a greater tech legacy, or maybe they just know them by the copy makers. But it was a different story in the 1970s. Xerox was a hotbed of innovation, and they created something maybe you've heard of. It was the Palo Alto Research Center, or PARC. And inside this collection of buildings, perhaps the most talented engineers the world has ever seen, they created amazing technology that was the foundation for most of the modern tech we use today and probably take for granted. Things like AirPods, the original Sony Walkman, the Apple iPod. These engineers were building without restrictions or restraint. They were trying to compete with the onslaught of equally awesome tech coming in from Japan. They didn't know what they were building. They weren't sure what it was that they were looking for at all. So the engineers were building all of this awesome technology without the benefit, or I guess hindrance, of even worrying about what they were making, or as it turned out, who they were making it for, which was a problem until it wasn't. So modern revisionist history makes it seem like Jobs and Gates stole everything from the engineers at PARC. But the reality is, he kind of did. So officially, Steve Jobs paid the engineers at PARC 100,000 Apple shares. It didn't even go to main Xerox, it just went to the guys at PARC. And I'm gonna back up a second. There's an old saying, loose lips sink ships, and that was clearly the case here. Xerox back in the 70s might as well have been two separate companies. The main Xerox executives doing main Xerox things, and the renegades, the rogues at PARC, who were making all of this crazy stuff, and neither really talked, and the executives had very little interest in what the PARC folks were doing. So when Steve Jobs and later Bill Gates showed up, wide-eyed and interested in what they had, the engineers got excited. And as history will tell, got a little too excited and maybe overshared more than they should have. Showed them concepts they were working on, showed them renegade ideas that they were trying, showed them things that we'd never seen before, like the mouse and how that worked on a screen and a GUI, all this amazing things. And Jobs and Gates, I'm imagining a big light bulb over their eyes, got excited and frothing at the mouth. And the more excited Jobs and Gates got, the more excited the engineers got. And this is probably gonna go down in history as one of the biggest heists of all time, even with what Apple's trading at nowadays. So Jobs didn't even want to go to Xerox PARC in the first place. It took a month or so of his employees pestering him before he even decided to show up. And it's kind of commonly thought that Gates and Jobs were enemies because, Apple and Microsoft. But they were actually pretty close friends, and Jobs brought Gates back to PARC about a week or so later. So this kind of got me wondering, what would happen to this admittedly fragile tech timeline if Steve Jobs continues to be stubborn and doesn't go to visit the folks at Xerox PARC? Well, obviously, we'll never know. But one thing is sure, tech as we know it will look drastically different. I think it's fair to assume that Steve Jobs continues to be stubborn and never goes to visit PARC, and word filters down to his friend at Microsoft, Bill Gates, that something is happening there. So he goes to visit, he gets to see the Alto computer firsthand. This prototype that has a mouse and a graphical user interface, and maybe he makes the same deal that Steve Jobs would have made. Here's 100,000 shares of Microsoft stock, show me everything. Gates gets excited, he gets all this IP and information for himself. Windows, comes out a few years later and looks drastically different and dominates the market. Apple, who never had the benefit of seeing what was going on at Park, continues to put out their own operating system, which without the GUI is drastically inferior. We never get the graphic-heavy Lisa 2 or Macintosh line, and in the weight of competition that Microsoft has with Windows, Apple fails, and Apple is dead before any of the future innovation ever starts to happen. The 1980s was a crazy cool time, unless we're talking about hair and fashion.
What you talking about, Willis?
It's where we saw the foundation of modern tech. Game Boy, cell phone, cable TV, GUI, home PCs, all of this stuff got its start in the 80s. And that was sort of the decade where people started to associate themselves with technology. You weren't cool unless you were walking around with a Walkman. The 1980s we remember as a decade of the invasion of the home PC. It was the first time I saw a home computer and got to use it and sort of remember what that was like. This didn't exist in the 70s, and we take it for granted now, but it was during the 80s where these things were absolutely everywhere. Kind of got its start around 1982 when Microsoft partnered up with IBM to release their DOS operating system on IBM computers. People started buying them in droves. They took the world by storm. Later, Windows would come to IBM computers. We saw other manufacturers hopping on board. Compaq came out with Windows computers. They were one of the first. Then we started seeing more and more manufacturers. And by the time the decade closed out at the end of '89, PCs and Macs were everywhere. So 1980s were obviously awesome for tech and action movies, but the middle of the decade was not so kind to Steve Jobs. He was forced out of Apple in 1985 and later went on to found Next and went working on a new operating system. And unintentionally or fortuitously, this new operating system is still the foundation today for the modern Mac OS. So what if Apple doesn't make it out of the 70s? Reality is they didn't contribute much to the 80s outside of computers, so things probably don't look that different. What might change though are some of the brands that maybe you've heard of. So IBM, HP, Compaq, and Xerox become way bigger. Perhaps Xerox finally gets the Alto computer out and they've got their own GUI. Maybe the Alto 2 comes out or Alto OS. Perhaps Microsoft doesn't even end up as the most dominant operating system. There was a lot of open space. People were buying first computers. They were open to any new experience. So any of these manufacturers could have provided that one new experience that ended up being the dominant OS going forward. So had Apple gone bankrupt, I think consumer technology right now would aesthetically look pretty similar to the products that you probably have in your pocket or even are watching this video on. But what would have been very different is a childhood of kids that were born in the late 80s and the 90s. The movies that we grew up on, things like The Incredibles, WALL-E, Up, Toy Story, wouldn't have existed, and even Disney themselves may not have made it out of the 90s. And maybe it's shallow, but that's not a reality that I really want to live in. So the 80s maybe didn't end so well, but the 90s, things were starting to look up. By the time we got to around 1995, Next was transitioning away from making hardware to making software. And Jobs had bought out kind of a little known division of LucasArts and changed their name to Pixar. And their very first movie, Toy Story, came out. The fact that they're still making them should tell you, it was a huge success. Steve Jobs was getting a ton of heat, which kind of inadvertently was setting the stage for the prodigal son to return. So there are bad months, and then there's Gil Amelio in the 90s bad months. He was the CEO of Apple at the time, and by all accounts, they were about 90 days away from completely running out of cash, having to declare bankruptcy. And I guess to make things even worse for them, Windows 95 proved to be a runaway success. It It was a dark time for Apple, and it was definitely time for a change. So what happened was pretty insignificant. Next, and Apple decided to merge their resources, and Steve Jobs returned as interim CEO. So Steve Jobs returned to Apple, and I'm imagining him with like a real literal axe, just chopping and chopping product lines, setting the stage for, I think, one of the greatest comebacks in really modern tech history. This is when we saw the iMac G3 release. We saw an emphasis on the aesthetics of computers. Beige boxes, black boxes all went away, and we saw a really new design language for consumer tech that really only started after Jobs came back to Apple. When you think about these momentous things that impacted pop culture, they're generally not things that had to be bought, but sometimes advertisements have that huge impact. Apple's 1984 ad campaign was pretty momentous. The lady throwing the hammer, people remembered it. But actually, Apple got some of that ad swagger back in 1997 with their Think Different campaign, and this shifted pop culture, and it did exactly what the slogan said. It made people start to think differently about Apple.
The troublemakers. The round pegs in the square holes. The ones who see things differently.
Right, so we're back in our what if alternate timeline scenario, and I never had the privilege of meeting Steve Jobs, but I don't think it's too far of a reach to say he seems like a dude who could hold a serious grudge. And imagine the size of that grudge being kicked out from the company you founded. So Apple comes to him 3 months away from bankruptcy and says, let's join forces, you come back. I think it's fair to say that maybe he thought about saying, kick rocks, Apple, you made your bed, you deal with the consequences. So what happens in this scenario? Jobs lets Apple, for lack of a better analogy, die on the vine, and goes over and picks the carcass of what's left. Maybe picks up some of their patents and continues to develop the Next software. And I remember already, Next had moved away from hardware. And out of this Next software, you get things like the Finder. Get the ability to move windows around inside of a GUI. This is where web apps started. This is really the beginning of the modern operating system. So Jobs continues to develop that. He continues to work on it and goes on to release Next OS. So what does this world look like? Maybe there isn't as much tough competition as you had with Apple and Windows 95. Windows 95 still comes out and is on a lot of computers, but Apple is now looking for hardware partners to put their operating system on. Maybe creating some sort of confusion in the marketplace, similar to Android. You buy a computer from one manufacturer, maybe it's got Windows, another, maybe it's going to have Next operating system on it. Maybe the experience isn't as good, maybe consumers don't end up buying as many computers. If there's not as much competition, prices stay higher, fewer families look to get computers. And this is a time where kids growing up, people my age, grew up with computers, had access to computers, and went on to develop these amazing things we have now, hardware and software that we couldn't live without. So in this scenario, those kids don't have access to computers, and the world as we know it looks different from a tech standpoint. And it all boils back to a very salty Steve Jobs saying no. So maybe it sounds foolish, short-sighted, or even slightly fanboyish to even make the suggestion that one man and one company could create such a huge ripple effect throughout the consumer electronics timeline, but that's exactly what Jobs and Apple did. And whether or not you like or dislike the man and the company he helped found, their mark on consumer electronics is indelible. And from the 2000s until today, the golden age of tech is about to begin. So the 2000s roll around and a big seismic shift happened. It's 2001, Steve Jobs gets up on stage and announces 1,000 songs in your pocket to go along with the new software called iTunes. Now, to say this is a paradigm shift is a drastic understatement, and that's not to say that MP3 players didn't exist before the iPod, and certainly existed long after. But this was a cultural moment This was the MP3 player to have as a status symbol. Think of it like AirPods now versus a third-party in-ear headphone. It was a really big deal, and it changed the way people consumed music, listened to music, and bought music. And the music world has never really ever been the same since the iPod. So obviously the iPod was a huge hit for Apple. A company can't survive on one product. So they were out to prove they weren't a one-hit wonder. And 6 years later, they announced kind of a new iPod, this time with a touchscreen and a phone. And of course, it was the iPhone. And to say it was a seismic shift in things would obviously be an understatement. The iPhone changed mobile communications, it changed personal communications, it changed cell phones forever. And one cool thing that the iPhone did, it kind of gave birth to the modern Android. So going back in time before the iPhone launched on Singular, Apple wanted Verizon to be their launch partner. Verizon is the largest carrier in the US. It made sense that they would be the ones that would sort of provide the service for the iPhone. Now, if you think back that long and what Verizon phones looked like, they all had that same Verizon UI on it. It was red, it was gangly, it was horrible, and Verizon insisted that they put their UI on the iPhone. And in typical Steve Jobs fashion, I imagine there were some expletives thrown in there. He said no, and ended up going with Singular. But I guess it does kind of make you wonder what would have happened if Apple had stuck with Verizon for the launch of the first iPhone.
We're very, very happy with this.
So if Verizon had launched the iPhone, what would it look like if Apple had gone out on the world's largest carrier? Would the Droid have just launched on Singular or T-Mobile or Sprint? We'll discuss that perhaps in another video, but the timeline that I want to explore is what if the iPhone didn't exist? What if we take Apple and the iPhone, sort of pull it out of the tech timeline? Cell phones certainly existed before 2007, and Blackberry was the prominent player at that time. And we saw manufacturers copy Apple's design language post-iPhone. I think it's safe to assume manufacturers would have copied BlackBerry's design language as that moved forward from earlier of 2007 all the way on to present time. And YouTubers and tech press alike would have still had plenty of stuff to talk about and debate. So what would we have seen? I got so into this idea that we actually mocked up a phone. So the iPhone made a couple things socially acceptable. It made non-removable battery socially acceptable. So we're taking all of that stuff completely out. So we've got a removable battery here. OLED technology would have continued to evolve. We would have still had close to bezel-less displays. People still would have wanted that. Camera technology would have gotten better. And I think in the craze of trying to get smaller and smaller bezels, we would have seen a pop-up camera. BlackBerry was showing at the time some tolerance to take some risks. I think we would have seen that continue. Text input was primarily done via physical keyboard, sometimes a stylus. Apple kind of ushered in the age of typing on a capacitive screen. We still would have seen that capacitive screen come to fruition and probably very similar to what we have right now, but I don't think the physical keyboard would have suffered such a quick death that it got when the iPhone launched. So what would peak physical keyboard look like? What would this peak design look like? It's been fun to think about this alternate timeline, and who's to say what a world without Apple would look like. I don't think it would be better, and I don't think it would be worse, but the timeline we're in right now where Apple exists is the only way that I know, and I kind of dig it. So if I had to pick, I prefer a world with Apple in it.
It must be love. Well, it must be love. Well, it must be love.
So it officially wraps part one. Let's start part two.
Can't tell